Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, you've probably seen or at least heard about the movie Arsenic and Old Lace. It's about two little old ladies who kill off tenants in their home with poison. Cary Grant starred in that movie. Did you know, though, that it was based on a true story out of Connecticut? Well, here to tell us about it are two representatives of the Windsor, Connecticut Historical Society. Michelle Tom is the librarian archiver and assistant director. Steph McGillivray is the museum educator. They have the absolutely fascinating details behind this story, and they're going to be along in just a moment to share them with you. This week's trivia question, the headstone in the graveyard reads XYZ. What crime was the unidentified villain shot and killed for? Stick around after the main program, you'll get the answer, and then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. You may not know the name Joseph Kesselring, but I'm sure you know the play that he wrote, his most famous one, Arsenic and Old Lace. That play debuted on Broadway back in 1941, and then the outstanding movie director Frank Capra brought in the star Cary Grant and turned it into a movie in 1944. Well, both of the versions, the theatrical and the Hollywood, convey the story of these two matronly old maids who turn out to be serial killers, but they convey it as a comedy. For those who were actually involved in the cases in the early 1900s in Windsor, Connecticut, this story was anything but amusing. Now, in the movie, two elderly women poison folks at their New York City home. In real life, Amy Archer Gilligan acted alone. She did so at her nursing home in Windsor. And as you're going to hear, there's some conjecture that would point to her having poisoned probably quite a few more people than she was ultimately accused of murdering. Well, here to tell us this incredible story are two representatives of the Windsor Historical Society. Michelle Tom is the librarian archiver and assistant director, and Steph McGillivray is a museum educator who has studied the Amy Archer Gilligan case in depth. Michelle, we're going to start off with you, and I'd like for you to tell us what the nursing home industry looked like. I mean, we didn't have nursing homes when Amy Archer Gilligan brought hers into Windsor, which we'll get into a little bit later. But can you just sort of tell us what was the lay of the land? How was elder care handled at that point in time?
Yes. So, Windsor, like many other towns, the population was pretty stable in the 19th century. But in the early 20th century, it really started to shoot up quite a lot. And you had a lot more, new technology, more industrialization, more people moving around a lot more easily. People began to see elder care as being more of a burden rather than a family responsibility. There were a lot more towns having these town poor farms. That's what it was called in Windsor, the poor farm. I think the sense of it being elder care being a burden was probably true for both the younger generations who couldn't take care of their parents and grandparents in the same way that people in earlier eras could, where you'd have multi-generations in the same family. The older generations didn't want to be burdens themselves. So having this new nursing home model was pretty novel and attractive to a lot of different families.
And is it fair to say that when Amy came into town with her nursing home, was that the first time Windsor had a nursing home?
Yes, Amy's nursing home was the first one. As I said, we had the town poor farm. It was also known as where they kept the paupers, I guess. So there was the town home where people without families, they were kept in the thing called the town poor farm.
So, Steph, let's bring you in now. And you've studied Amy Archer Gilligan extensively. We don't want to jump right into what happened in Windsor. Let's set it up a little bit and let's go back to, I guess she was born ironically on Halloween Day in 1868 in a little village in Connecticut called Milton. Tell me what it was like when she was born and tell me about her family.
She was one of 8 children. Apparently, there was some mental health issues within the family. One of her brothers, John, actually was an inmate, which we would call them a patient now, at the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane in 1902, and that's in Middletown. And I believe her mother did have a drug addiction to morphine. But I do know that in 1897, Amy married James Archer, and they would have a daughter, Mary, who would be born in December of that year.
Now, they moved to Newington, right, and met up with this guy, John Seymour. What do we know about that?
In exchange for care from Amy, he let the Archers into his home and let them live there, and they took care of him. After he passed, the Archers continued to rent the home from his heirs. They opened their first home, which they called Sister Amy's Nursing Home for the Elderly in Newington at that time.
I guess it was around 1907 after Seymour's died. His heirs have let them continue to rent the facility and open up Sister Amy's nursing home. When in 1907 they changed their mind to decide they're going to sell the building. So this is when I guess Amy and her husband then move on to Windsor?
Yep, that's exactly when. The Archers did move to Windsor, and they used their savings to purchase their own residence. They purchased the Archer Home for the elderly and chronic invalids. They were actually really pioneering elder care at the time, and so they were offering boarders the opportunity to pay $7 to $25 a week, or they could pay a one-time $1,000 life care fee, and they would be taken care of for the rest of their lives. And a lot of people chose that $1,000 a week.
Now, tell me something about the tenants, I guess we'll call them. 3 things that most of them had in common. Number 1, they were elderly. Number 2, they tended to be quite infirm. And number 3, they were kind of isolated, right? They didn't have nearby family or keep in touch with them. So would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's accurate. A lot of people who came to the home, they came because they needed help, but they didn't have family that would take them in. And so they had this option of Amy Archer taking care of them for $1,000 for the rest of their life. It seems like it's a really good deal for them.
So now in 1909, the first, what I would call crack in the armor maybe starts to show up. And you have this family in West Hartford, the McClintock family, that is upset about the care that one of their family members is receiving at her facility. What do we know about that?
The McClintock family of West Hartford, they did file a lawsuit about lack of care being given to an elderly family member. They sued them for $5,000. And the case was actually settled out of court. So it didn't go to trial, but the lawsuit did have an impact on the Archers.
Now, the pace of activity starts to heat up at this point, right? So it's 1910, and Amy's husband, James Archer, will die in 1910, leaving her with her 12-year-old daughter, Mary. What does she have to do for Mary?
James does die in 1910. He dies of Bright's disease, which is a kidney disorder. We would call it nephritis now. In addition to leaving the daughter behind, he also left a bunch of back taxes. And that was causing quite the financial hardship for her. She wrote a letter to the tax collector in Windsor, basically saying, how could you be expecting me to pay taxes? I'm providing a service. I'm providing a service that nobody wants to do. And you're expecting me to pay all of these taxes. And I have a daughter. I'm a single mother. So she really felt that what she was doing was so important that she needed a pass.
Michelle, let's bring you back in on this. I understand that the Windsor Historical Society actually has the original or a copy of, I think it's the original of that 1911 letter that Amy Archer wrote to the tax collector. What can you tell me about that?
Yes, we have this collection from the Gosley family. So Howard Gosley was the tax collector. Amy's daughter, Mary, was attending this Campbell School for Girls, which was a private school in town, and they required tuition. So she was writing in this letter to Howard Gosley. She says, quote, "No other town I ever heard of would think of taxing a home of this kind." She also alludes to her recently deceased husband, James Archer, when she says, quote, "I asked to be dealt with honestly. That is all. I fully realize my great loss and sorrow, and that I am alone, dependent on myself to care and educate my little daughter who was deprived of her dear father whom she loved so dearly. But I am not afraid to demand justice, and I think it is about time it is shown me."
Now, Steph, let's talk about what happened 3 years after her first husband dies. She ends up getting married in late 1913 to her second husband, Michael Gilligan. Tell me about Gilligan.
So Michael Gilligan he was known as larger than life. He was a well-respected citizen of Windsor. He was younger, in his late 50s, and they get married. And very, very shortly, like 3 months later, Michael is dead, but not before he changed his will to leave everything to Amy. And he died of, I think it was heart disease and acute bilious attack. An acute bilious attack is a old-timey way of saying indigestion, but really bad indigestion.
Now, I understand that his family, local family, was pretty upset that his entire estate went to her.
Oh, yes. They were very concerned. They were upset because, they were only married for maybe 3 months. They were very suspicious of the whole thing.
Later that same year, in fact, just a couple of months later, still now in 1914, a guy named Franklin Andrews has an issue. Now, the reason why Franklin Andrews is so interesting, and the reason why I wanted to establish with you earlier that most of her tenants were elderly, infirm, and kind of isolated, Andrews kind of broke that mold, right? He was 60 and he could still do chores and yard work and whatnot, and he kept in touch with his family. Tell me more about Mr. Andrews and then what happened to him.
Franklin had maybe a mild disability. He had a little limp, but he was very, very close with his family. They all lived in Hartford, and they were, he had brothers and sisters who were all married, and he didn't want to be a burden on any of them. So he sees this advertisement for $1,000 lifetime care from the Archer home, and he tells his sister and he tells his family that's where he's going to go, and that seems like a really good idea for him. And when he was there, he was actually thriving. He became kind of like a de facto handyman. He would help around the house. There's a story of him and Michael Gilligan painting a fence together. In fact, he was painting a fence like literally days before he died. He was doing still handyman work around the house. But here's the most interesting thing about Franklin is that he would write letters home to his family. And at the bottom of every letter, he would say something along the lines of, there are 11 people here out of 20. 10 people have died since I've been here, and they come and they go, and so on and so on and so on. And that's literally how he would end every letter. So he was kind of keeping score of how many people had come and gone since he had been there.
So now he is painting a fence. He collapses. 2 days later, he's dead. They say it's from a gastric ulcer. And one of his sisters, Natalie Pierce, comes in, is going through his belongings to clear out his room and whatnot. And she finds some more letters. What did she find?
She found a letter from Amy to Franklin asking him for a $500 loan. And in the letter, she says, don't tell anybody about this. It's just our little secret. And so Nellie sees this letter, and she is instantly suspicious. We need to talk about Franklin's death. At the time that Franklin passed away, the home was actually at capacity. Franklin was sharing a room with another man. Amy was approached by a married couple who wanted to move into the home, and they didn't have any space. And so she told them that there was going to be space available in the beginning of June. This is May that this is happening. She kind of pushes this couple off, and then she says, really going to be happening soon. And so Franklin passes away on May 29th, and the couple take the bed basically like June, like the beginning of June, June 1st, that first week of June. And so that's pretty telling as well.
At this point now, she goes to the state's attorney with her information. State's attorney kind of blows her off, isn't really all that interested. So she goes to the Hartford Courant, and it turns out that the Courant's guy who writes the obituaries for Windsor lives in Windsor. He's named Carlin Gosley, and I guess he's related to the tax collector. And he had his own concerns after writing all these obituaries, including a bunch from her home. So his antennae went up. And what did he do with drugstore registers?
So Carlin really was the first person to notice something was up at the house. Not only was he an obituary writer, he worked Hartford Boiler and Steam Company as an insurance man. And so he did this obituary writing as a hobby on the side. He also lived next door to the Archer home. And so what he was noticing and what kind of tipped him off was that the undertakers were coming at weird times. If somebody passed away in the home, the undertaker was there immediately and they were taken from the house like lickety split, which was really kind of strange for the time. And so he was like, this is weird. And then he started noticing a lot more deaths. And so that tipped him off, and he decided to independently check the drugstore registries in town, because at the time, if you purchased poison from a drugstore, it had to be registered with the state. So they had a record of who was buying poison. And so he looks at W.H.H. Mason's, that's a drugstore here in Windsor, and he found that Amy was purchasing a lot of arsenic, like at one point, he found 10 ounces of arsenic. 10 ounces of arsenic is enough to kill several hundred people. That's a lot of arsenic. And so that's what tipped him off. So he took his concerns to Clifford Sherman, who was the editor of the Hartford Courant. Clifford Sherman was also really good friends with the state's attorney at the time, Thomas Alcorn. So when Carlin brought his suspicions, Clifford said, keep investigating it. I'm going to tip off Thomas Alcorn and we'll see what happens. And so Thomas Alcorn gets wind of it and they bring it to the governor. And the governor launches a full state police investigation. Now, the Connecticut State Police have only been around for a few years. They were founded in 1903 as the very first state police department in the country. Windsor had something called the Rogue Detecting Agency, which is basically like a citizen-run police department. Newspapers actually did a lot of the investigating for law enforcement at the time, because journalists had the access and they had the questions and they can get the evidence. There was this back and forth between law enforcement and journalists at the time. So Carlin Gosley, he not only investigates as a freelance writer for the Hartford Courant, but he also is the grand juror for Windsor. And that's another super important fact about Carlin, because a grand jury is the jury that decides whether or not there's enough evidence to charge somebody with a crime. He knew that Amy was doing something, and he was also the grand juror. Carlin was in the rogue. I think he started it.
Amazing stuff. Now, I understand that Amy had mentioned that she was buying all this arsenic because she had rats and bed bugs in the place, and the Hartford Courant, heard that, but still went on and looked at things. And when the deaths at her nursing home started to accelerate, which was about the same time that the taxes were increasing, and they compared her nursing home to one of the only others in the state at that point. I guess one in Hartford that was 7 times larger. And during that same time period, the much larger facility had the same number of deaths, meaning it was just out of proportion at Amy's place. Now, they also found out that the kinds of deaths were sudden from looking at all the death certificates, and they had stomach pathologies, which was kind of interesting. And a lot of them came shortly after these tenants had given them large sums of money. Do I have that right?
You have that right. You have that right. So they actually looked at residents of the Jefferson Street home for the elderly in Hartford. They were finding that in the same year, the Archer home and the Jefferson home had the same amount of deaths. And you're right, it was 6 times larger than the Archer home. And so that was something that really kind of also tipped people off.
Now, the one thing, and you're right about the state police and the journalist society working together, the one thing, of course, journalism couldn't do that the state police could once they got involved was start to exhume bodies. And what did they find?
So they exhumed Franklin Andrews' body. They also exhumed Michael Gilligan's body and a few others. In Andrews' stomach alone, they found enough arsenic, it was testified, to, quote, kill 6 strong men. So it takes about 4 grains of arsenic to kill you. And when they sent out Franklin's samples, they sent it to a number of different pathologists to test his stomach lining. And they found varying degrees of arsenic, but at one point in his stomach, they found about 20 grains of arsenic. That's enough to kill several people. And they did that after getting the warrant, thanks to Nellie's letter. Back when people were first being embalmed, like funeral homes, they would use arsenic in their embalming fluid. Except the home that Amy sent all of the bodies from her house to stopped using arsenic in their embalming fluid like 18 years beforehand, which is how they were able to determine that it was arsenic added from Amy and not from the embalming. There was a doctor in town, his name was Dr. King. He was always the one that went to the Archer home to look after the patients, and he's the one that fills out the death certificate. So he was the one finding all of these stomach ailments, but didn't think anything of it. Like literally didn't think anything was weird about it, didn't think anything was off. In fact, I think at the trial, he was still kind of thinking Amy was innocent.
Now, I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of observers think that she probably killed a lot of people, but she was actually only officially charged with 5 deaths when she was arrested. Is that correct?
She was charged with 5 deaths, but she was only tried for 1.
Explain how that worked.
They indicted her for the murders of Franklin Andrews, Michael Gilligan, and a couple of others. They couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had killed Michael Gilligan and those other 3 people. But with Franklin's letters home to his family, the letter that Nellie found, and the arsenic in his system, Franklin had enough evidence to be tried in the trial. They had enough probable cause or a reasonable doubt to try her for his murder.
Now, in hindsight, with facts that we have today, it seems like a open shut case. But what I guess they didn't know at the time was, or didn't put the pieces together, was that when her first husband died, James Archer, back in 1910, she had taken out a life insurance policy on him weeks before his death, and then they find out years later that she apparently or allegedly forged her second husband's will, which changed his entire estate and gave it all to her. And this is the guy who died 3 months after she got married to him. So is that suspicious?
Yeah.
Michelle, you have some oral histories at the Windsor Historical Society that speak to literally this case. Could you tell us about those?
We have a couple of oral histories that talk about Amy. One comes from a woman named Lenora Jubry. In the interview, she mentions that she didn't know her mother when she was growing up in Windsor, but her mother's name was Rose Swan. It turns out that Rose Swan was a housekeeper in the Archer home for at least a few years. But at some point, she must have had a mental breakdown because her family sent her to the state hospital in Middletown. But Lenora Jubry was essentially told by her family that her mother went a little crazy after being poisoned by Amy Archer Gilligan because she knew too much. So it sounds like Amy was trying to tie off some loose ends there. Another one is with a woman named Jane Nearing, who was a teenager in the early 20th century. She remembered doing missionary work at the Archer home, singing hymns for the older residents who couldn't go to church. And she said, quote, "When we were leaving, Mrs. Gilligan said to us, 'I hope you don't believe all the stories they're telling about me.'" And actually, Jane hadn't heard any stories at that point, but she sure found out later. She actually even visited Amy in prison later because her father was a chaplain there. And she said that Mrs. Gilligan, she kind of sat in the corner. She didn't talk very much.
Amy Archer Gilligan was tried twice. The first time, she was convicted and sentenced to be hanged. Well, she appealed, and this time she pleaded insanity, and she got a conviction again, but only a life sentence. A few years after that, she'd end up in the same hospital for the insane in Middletown, Connecticut, to which her brother had been committed many decades before that. She died there at the age of 89 in 1962. One final footnote on this bizarre case: the very first regulations on elder care and nursing homes in the entire United States were brought to bear legislatively due to this case. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, ironically, one of those projects supported by all those tax increases that put Amy into her financial squeeze was a public works project that straightened out a series of very dangerous 90-degree turns in a road that went under a railroad overpass. Those roads were just around the corner from Amy's nursing home, and the project in the official town records was called the Death Trap. I want to thank our guests for today's program, two representatives of the Windsor Historical Society, Michelle Tom, their librarian, archiver, and assistant director, and Steph McGillivray, museum educator. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question, as a reminder, was, the headstone in the graveyard reads XYZ. What crime was this unidentified villain shot and killed for? The answer is bank robbery. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to tell you the tale of the unidentified bank robber who was actually shot and killed as he tried to climb in a window at the bank in the middle of the night in Deep River, Connecticut, back in the year 1900. And we'll also share not only what we know about him, but this mysterious lady in black who visited his grave religiously every year. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.